Unit 8, Grade 10, that is characteristics of organism. So that day we studied a few activities. Today we are going to see about the respiration. Respiration means the process by which the stored food, that is actually glucose, is transformed into energy. So after digestion, the glucose is taken to the cells, and the same way oxygen is taken by blood from the lungs, and after that that stored food, that is glucose, is burnt by react with oxygen and produce energy. So this reaction, the respiration reaction, occurs in mitochondria in the cells. You earlier studied about that in the cells. During respiration, carbon dioxide is released and the oxygen is absorbed. Oxygen that is inhaled and the carbon dioxide exhaled. So the activity 2 shows, that is experiment to show the release of carbon dioxide during respiration. So we are going to see about that. So this is the activity. So here the first one, 4 conical flasks are taken. So you can take 5 also, 4 conical flasks. So the first flask, flask A, sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide can be taken. So potassium hydroxide can absorb CO2 in air. So air, if CO2 is present in air, that CO2 can be absorbed by potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide. Lime water we are using for identifying CO2. Lime water is colorless. When the CO2 is added, it becomes milky. Third one, flask C, there is an organism, insect. You can take frog or a rat or something, the organism. Then flask D, again lime water to identify CO2. Here the water and the tap also here. Now initially the air is present inside the flask, fully filled with air. So the outside air cannot enter inside. So what we can do, we can slowly open this tap. What happened? The water released out slowly. So the air here move downwards. So after that the air in flask D moves here. Like that the air will move towards E from A. So then the atmospheric air can enter into flask A. So the atmospheric air contains carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, so present in air. So then when atmospheric air enter inside flask A, the CO2 in air, that is carbon dioxide in air, is absorbed by potassium hydroxide. So the air released from flask A does not contain CO2. Carbon dioxide is not here in air moving in this tube. Therefore, the lime water in flask D does not turn milky because no carbon dioxide in entering air. Therefore, this won't turn milky. So the air released out from this flask B also no CO2, carbon dioxide is not present. So what happened? The air is going inside without CO2, but this air contains oxygen. That oxygen is inhaled by this insect and release carbon dioxide. Respiration occurs here, so it intake oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So the air released from the flask C contains CO2. So that due to that CO2, lime water in flask D turns milky. So this is showing actually CO2 is released by the insect because the entering air no CO2, but the air released from C, CO2 is present. Therefore CO2 is released by the respiration. So you can take that is germinating seeds instead of insect. Germinating seeds you can take. So that also the same observation you can get. But green plants you can't use because the green plants doing photosynthesis in the front of sunlight. So what happened? The green plants inhale oxygen during respiration and release CO2, the same as insect. But that CO2 reabsorbed by the plants again for photosynthesis. Therefore, the air released from flask C does not contain CO2. Therefore, this lime water does not turn milky. So, you can't get any conclusion when you are using green plants in this experiment. So, next one, activity 3, that is showing experiment to show absorption of oxygen in respiration. So absorption of oxygen in respiration, here you can do this experiment was given here. So here in the conical flask germinating seeds are taken, and here there is a small ignition tube with a potassium hydroxide. So what happened? Initially air is present in the conical flask. The carbon dioxide in air is absorbed by potassium hydroxide. At the same time, the oxygen in air inhaled by germinating seeds. For respiration, they inhale oxygen in air and release CO2 again. So that CO2 also absorbed by potassium hydroxide. That means CO2 in the flask initially also absorbed by KOH, and again absorbing O2 from the air and release CO2, that also released by that also absorbed by the potassium hydroxide. So the carbon dioxide and oxygen not present in this air. So there is a air loss in this flask. To fill that gap, the air in the tube move towards flask. Therefore, the water rises up through this tube. So here they are taking assumption, that is assumption they are taking the intaking oxygen is equal to CO2 released. The equal volume of oxygen is absorbed and the released carbon dioxide. So for this experiment, you can make control experiment without this potassium hydroxide. You have to set up a flask without potassium hydroxide. So what happened? The germinating seeds absorb oxygen, intake oxygen for respiration and give out CO2. So the volume of intaken oxygen and the released carbon dioxide is equal. So there is no air gap forming in the flask. Therefore, the water won't rises up. So that is the control experiment for this experiment. This is the main experiment, control experiment without potassium hydroxide. So this is up to respiration. So there is a assignment is given in your book, that is 5 organisms given, and you have to explain the respiratory movements. So that is given here, I gave in the notes. You refer that. The next one, irritability and coordination. Irritability and coordination. So a change which the strong enough to bring about response is known as stimulus. Stimulus means all changes happen in the environment. That is hearing sound, seeing objects, that is feeling hotness, all the change happen in the environment is the stimulus. So the stimulus can be identified by sense organs. The 5 sense organs are in human body: eye, ear, nose, tongue, skin. So from these sense organs we can identify the stimulus. So due to this stimulus our body will react. So that we call response. The reactions according to the changes in the environment are known as responses. So the responses made by effector. Effector is muscles or glands. Muscles and glands are working as effector. So actually here the sense organs are connected to the nervous system. So the nervous system only responsible for coordination in human. So some examples are given here. The first one, sweating when the environmental temperature increases. You know, when the environmental temperature increases, sweats. So here the sense organ, skin. We feel hotness by skin. So sense organ is skin. So what is the stimulus? Heat. What is the change happen in the environment? Heat. So stimulus, heat. What is the response? Sweating. So due to heat, sweating. So the effector is sweat glands. The sweat glands only secretes sweat from our body. Second example, Mala closed her ears when heard heavy sound. So here the sense organ, ear. She is hearing sound through ear. So the ear is the sense organ. Stimulus is sound, heavy sound. Response, closing of ears. Closing her ears with hands. That is, closing of ears is the response. So the effector, hand muscles. She is closing with hands. Therefore, the effector is hand muscles. So these are the some examples given. So if they given an incident, you should know to identify these four: sense organ, stimulus, response, and effector. The ability to respond to stimuli received from internal and external environment is known as irritability. That is, responding due to stimulus. That is the irritability. The communication between different organs. For this irritability, the different organs are communicating. That is, we call coordination.